You've heard the message, carbohydrates make us fat. You've probably even seen or de-emphasized and overemphasized again the popularity of diet books on sale today. If you do a quick search online for carbohydrate books, you'll see over 4 million results pop up instantly. You'll see books like The Ultimate Carbohydrate Counter and The Ultimate Low Carb Diet Cookbook, and the entire series of books by Dr. Atkins. So, is this accurate? Have our traditional guidelines to eat high carbohydrate levels been completely misguided? Or worse, harmful? Maybe carbs are to blame for the now 2.1 billion people, and that is 30% of the world, that are obese. The short answer is that carbohydrates, particularly sugary desserts, sodas, and even sports drinks, cause dramatic changes to your hormones and can prime your body to store fat. These foods have what we call added sugars. If you didn't know it, sugar is one form of carbohydrate. And added sugars means that sugar was added in the preparation of the food. And this is different from the sugar that is naturally in the food. It is a difference between sugars in a candy bar compared to the sugar you would find in fruit. Most people don't think they eat many added sugars. The trouble is, sugars are hidden in many of the foods we eat, like candy, crackers, many boxed goods, because sugar provides a flavor that most people like. In fact, most of the foods we eat are pre-packaged. They have sugars. To find out, just have a look at the nutrition label, and you'll be able to see a section called sugars. This is most likely from added sugars. Added sugars have been shown to increase inflammation in our vascular system and are linked with diabetes, and are recently shown to increase your risk of death from cardiovascular disease. So, how much added sugar is acceptable? Well, unfortunately, the current recommendations vary a lot. The Institute of Medicine recommends that less than 25% of your total calorie intake come from added sugars. But the World Health Organization recently lowered their recommendation of added sugars from less than 10% to less than 5% of total daily calorie intake. In real life, it can be hard to determine how much this actually is in terms of real food. For example, the American Heart Association recommends less than 100 calories or 25 grams of added sugar for women and less than 150 calories or 38 grams of added sugar for men. Considering that 1 teaspoon is equal to roughly 4 grams of sugar, a woman would be able to afford about 6 teaspoons of added sugar, and a man can eat about 9 teaspoons of added sugar. Just to illustrate, 12 ounces of one popular soda has about 39 grams of sugar, or just over 9 teaspoons. This exceeds the highest recommendation for the entire day for men and women. Does this seem like a lot? Well, it is, but some people use the same amount of added sugar just in their morning coffee. Also, if you look at the labels for any packaged foods you eat, this number of added sugar will quickly rise above recommended values. And keep this in mind, the recommended value is given just to avoid major health issues. It certainly is not about how to look and feel your best. Another tricky part about this part of nutrition is that sugar can hide very well. It goes by many other names such as cane syrup, molasses, sucrose, maltodextrin, and others. If you see multiple names of sugars like these on a food label, you might want to think about another choice. You can also look for food labels that say no added sugar. Believe it or not, over 70% of US adults take in more than 10% of their daily calories from added sugar, from things like boxed goods, baked items, cereals, and sodas. Luckily, there are some easy ways to minimize your intake of added sugar. And one of the easiest changes to make is simply to avoid drinking excess sugar. If you can avoid sugary sodas, juices, and energy drinks, you can easily save a ton of added sugar and added calories. So, you might ask yourself what types of carbohydrates exist. Well, carbohydrates include things like fruit, pasta, whole grains, corn, peas, and breads. But do they all have the same impact on our bodies? For example, is fruit considered a carbohydrate just like pasta? Do candy bars affect us the same way as a bowl of oatmeal or a serving of green beans does? Well, in this lecture on carbohydrates, you will learn why carbohydrates don't have to be scary or off limits. You will also learn how carbohydrates impact your body composition and health, why there are certain carbohydrates to eat at certain times of the day, and how exercise fits into this puzzle. In the end, you will have a firm grasp of the ways that carbohydrates that exist and how and why they may impact our body composition differently, and when you can eat a high carbohydrate meal with less fear of storing it as fat. The first thing to keep in mind is that glucose is the preferred fuel source by your brain and your nervous system, as opposed to protein or fat. The body needs glucose for some actions, and it is estimated that we actually make about 50 grams of glucose per day in a process called gluconeogenesis. This amount is quite low, and for people who are physically active and like to exercise, the amount of carbohydrate needed will likely be more. Well, the current acceptable macronutrient distribution range from the Institute of Medicine for carbohydrate is between 45 and 65% of your total calorie intake, with no less than 130 grams of carbohydrate per day to meet our basic physiological needs. And because 1 gram of carbohydrate yields 4 calories, you will need roughly 500 calories per day from carbohydrate just to meet minimal needs. However, more and more research is beginning to accumulate, showing that we may be able to consume far less than 130 grams per day, so long as the dietary fat and protein are also increased in the diet. Fortunately, when you eat very little carbohydrate, you can still function from the production of ketones, which is simply a byproduct of excessive fat breakdown as a result of a low carbohydrate diet. This excess fat breakdown is called ketosis. And recently, ketone use for energy has been the topic of much research and debate. And currently, in 2015, some experts support nutritional ketosis for weight loss and health. Nutritional ketosis is induced when a person is put on a very low carbohydrate diet to encourage the breakdown of excess fat. Other experts recommend the traditional model of a higher carbohydrate, low-fat diet for weight management and health. In any case, the research is quite clear that some glucose is required for life, and even more is likely needed if you decide to become extremely active. However, most scientists agree that the US is an overcarbed nation. They recommend that the steps should be taken to identify what carbohydrates are best to eat at what times during the day to provide the best health and performance benefits and to minimize negative changes to body composition. We know that how active you are, what size you are, and what your specific goals are will dictate how much carbohydrate you should have in your diet. And of the 3 macronutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins, carbohydrates are traditionally thought of as the most important fuel for exercise, particularly during high-intensity exercise like running fast, cycling fast, and lifting heavy weights. A few examples of common carbohydrate-rich foods that you are familiar with are grains, pastas, potatoes, and rice. But carbohydrates are also found in fruits and vegetables. And sugar itself is also a very simple form of carbohydrate, meaning it is rapidly digested and absorbed by your body. These foods are all considered carbohydrates due to their similar chemical structure. Carbohydrates are all composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in a 1:2:1 ratio. The important point is that the breakdown of these atoms ultimately provides ATP, or the energy needed for all human functions. So, the carbohydrate foods that we eat can range from quite simple, like sugar, to more complex forms like starches and fibers. This ultimately determines how quickly we can digest, absorb, and use them to fuel our activity and store them as fat in our muscles, liver, and fat tissue. We classify carbohydrates by their structure from simplest to most complex. And these include monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and polysaccharides. In all of these types of carbohydrates, the term saccharide means sugar, from the Greek word saccharum. The prefixes mono, di, oligo, and poly refer to how many sugars are linked together. So mono would be 1 sugar, di would be 2 sugar molecules, oligo would be 3 to 9 molecules, and poly would be 10 or more sugar molecules bound together. The simplest form of carbohydrate is the monosaccharide, which consists of only 1 sugar molecule. You probably have heard of these because they are household names like glucose and fructose, which is derived from fruit sugar. When monosaccharides are combined, a disaccharide is formed, such as sucrose. Fructose and glucose bound together, also known as table sugar. Longer chains of monosaccharides can also combine to form oligosaccharides, which are commonly found in vegetables, and even longer chains called polysaccharides. If you've ever heard of starch, glycogen, or fiber, you are hearing about polysaccharides. The point is that the length of the carbohydrate chain is one factor that determines the rate of carbohydrate breakdown. Obviously, the shorter the chain, the faster this rate becomes. In terms of overall health, you actually want a slower rate of breakdown to avoid any large variations in blood sugar and insulin concentrations. Insulin is one hormone responsible for inhibiting our ability to use fat as a fuel. Another interesting factor that determines the rate of carbohydrate breakdown is the shape of the carbohydrate. So starch, which is a carbohydrate from plant sources, can have 2 basic forms. Amylose is a straight, long-chain molecule, which is digested slowly. Amylopectin, on the other hand, is a highly branched and rapidly digested molecule due to the increased surface area of the molecule due to the branched structure. And glycogen is also highly branched, and it's in the form of carbohydrate that we store in our bodies. In the context of body composition, we typically just think about carbohydrates that we eat as something that either makes us fat or doesn't. However, we also have to remember that carbohydrates provide us with fuel to ultimately produce energy, especially when we try to exercise at high intensity. Through a process called glycogenolysis, or the breaking apart of glycogen, glucose fuels active muscles during exercise. About 100 grams of glycogen are stored in your liver, with another 300 to 900 grams stored in your skeletal muscles, and just a minor amount circulating in your blood. So if you weigh 150 pounds or 68 kilograms, you will store somewhere around 500 to 1,000 grams of glycogen, or roughly 2,000 or maybe up to 4,000 calories of fuel as carbohydrate. Another source of carbohydrate that has clear health and body composition benefits is fiber. Now, dietary fibers are from plants and are not digested or absorbed by humans. So obviously, having these in your diet will slow the rate of carbohydrate digestion, which is usually a good thing. The only exception would be for some athletes during exercise. This is when an athlete needs food that can be digested and absorbed quickly. Dietary fibers are found in foods like bananas, oatmeal, beans, whole grains, and dark leafy greens. Fiber may help you feel full or satiated for a longer period of time and might help lower your blood cholesterol levels and your blood fat levels, and maybe even improve overall gut health. That means you might eat less by including fiber in your meals. And you may be wondering, how much fiber should I eat? Well, the minimum recommendations of fiber from the Institute of Medicine is to eat about 14 grams of fiber per every 1,000 calories that you eat. This is about 25 grams per day for women and 38 grams per day for men. However, it's useful to note that these numbers were set to prevent health issues and not necessarily to live optimally. Anyway, fruit like a banana has 5 grams of fiber, and 1 cup of baked beans has about 15 grams of fiber. Now, I think it's interesting to talk about mono, di, and polysaccharides along with starches and fibers, but we don't really eat like this. We eat real food. So while it's important to know about the different types of sugars and how fast or how slow they get into our bloodstream, first we must understand how the food we eat, like a piece of bread or an apple, are broken down from this complex form into smaller monosaccharide subunits and eventually put into our bloodstream as glucose. The process of carbohydrate breakdown starts in our mouth with an enzyme called salivary amylase. It breaks the long sugars apart into smaller subunits to be absorbed. And these small, simple carbohydrates move through the cell lining of the small intestine and into the blood in capillaries that lead to the portal vein. And the portal vein takes the blood to the liver, and the liver takes what glucose it needs for its own energy requirements, and also what it needs to store as glycogen. The remaining glucose continues to circulate in the blood. And no matter what carbohydrates you eat, ultimately it will be in your blood as glucose because your body favors glucose for production of energy, or ATP. The fructose you eat is actually stored as liver glycogen. And once the liver stores all the glycogen it needs from fructose, fructose then serves to increase fat synthesis. Clearly, this may not be the best for overall health. The end result of carb breakdown is glucose being directed into circulation and ultimately to the cells that need it throughout your body. So, you are probably asking how all this relates to body composition. There is a limit to how much glucose the body can use, and when those uses are met, the body responds by storing the energy in other forms, such as fat. The glucose in your blood is used by cells to produce energy, especially by your nervous system and red blood cells. Glucose can also be stored as glycogen for later use, or the fat cells can remove glucose from the blood to form glycerol that is needed for triglyceride or fat storage. What is important to understand is that our bodies work best for us when blood glucose remains at a constant level, without large fluctuations throughout the day. And to a large extent, blood glucose levels can determine our mood and our energy levels. Just think about the last time you were really hungry. You might find yourself irritable, angry, and moody. We like to call this hangry, and I know that at my house it's clear when somebody needs some food, fast. Anyway, much of this mood change is determined when your blood glucose dips too low or gets too high. And after an overnight fast, we are able to maintain our blood glucose values using glycogenolysis, or the breakdown of glycogen to make glucose, and gluconeogenesis, the creation of new glucose from non-carbohydrate sources in the liver. Now, glycogenolysis provides about 65 to 75% of the glucose released into your blood. And gluconeogenesis provides the remaining 25 to 35% of the glucose released by the liver. Interestingly, once you store glucose as muscle glycogen, it cannot be converted back into blood glucose. It is, in essence, locked in your cells, and it must be used for energy. So, only liver glycogen can help to maintain your blood glucose concentrations, not muscle glycogen. And some carbohydrate foods can have a dramatic impact on how high your blood glucose will rise after a meal. Some foods only have a minor effect on blood glucose, which naturally your body would prefer as it likes things to stay constant. When blood sugar is elevated for a prolonged period of time, numerous detrimental health and body composition outcomes can occur, particularly for people who are hypo or hyperglycemic. The good thing is that we have an index that can tell us how quickly a food you eat will raise your blood glucose levels. You may have even heard of it. It's called the glycemic index. The glycemic index gives us an idea of how quickly 50 grams of a specific food can raise your blood glucose levels compared to 50 grams of table sugar, which is given a glycemic index value of 100. Now, why is this important? Well, by knowing the glycemic index of common foods that you eat, you will have an idea of what your blood glucose response will be after you eat that food. The higher your blood glucose, the higher the hormone insulin is in your blood. If you know about diabetes, you know about insulin. The hormone is highly involved with the storage of carbohydrates into your cells. Insulin also blunts fat burning in most cases. It plays a critical role in this important function of balancing blood glucose levels. If you have high insulin levels for a prolonged period of time, losing fat will likely be much more difficult to do. High levels of insulin also may interfere with your ability to achieve optimal health. Now, you might imagine that foods like breads, pastries, and bagels would have a high glycemic index, and therefore spike your blood sugar. Well, you're correct. But on the other hand, foods like apples, cherries, beans, and nuts tend to have a much lower glycemic index. So it is quite easy to see why many nutrition experts recommend eating foods that primarily have a low glycemic index value. However, if you based your entire diet upon the glycemic index, that isn't optimal either. This is because, one, you don't always eat 50 grams of a particular food, which is, as you know, what the entire glycemic index is based upon. And two, we typically don't eat just one nutrient at a time. You would eat a meal of mixed carbohydrate, fat, and protein. Therefore, if you had a high glycemic index food such as a handful of pretzels, this wouldn't cause much of a problem if you combine them with lower glycemic foods like a serving of vegetables and a lean protein. Interestingly, how you prepare foods in the kitchen can influence the glycemic index of the food as well. For example, simply boiling carrots will raise their glycemic index. It is also important to recall that the glycemic index of a food doesn't tell you much about the quality of that food. For example, the American Diabetes Association stresses that many nutritious foods have a higher glycemic index than foods that we typically think of as junk food. For example, some candy bars have a similar glycemic index value to green peas. So, if you're monitoring the glycemic index of foods only, then you need to be cautious about eating green peas as you would be about eating some candy bars. But do you really eat the same serving size and weight of peas as easily as you would from a candy bar? Well, probably not. You see, it's quite easy to eat 50 grams of some foods, but rather hard to eat 50 grams of others. Celery, for example. So, it is clear that the glycemic index provides a snapshot of good information, but needs to be balanced with some other basic nutrition principles. One of the mechanisms that has been developed to overcome some, but not all of the shortcomings of the glycemic index is called the glycemic load. Well, the glycemic load is the glycemic index of a particular food multiplied by the actual amount of food that you eat. And similar to a high glycemic index, a high glycemic load of a carbohydrate food means that your blood glucose values will increase quickly. This glucose response is used to predict what should happen to insulin levels. The trouble is, there is not always a direct correlation between a high glycemic index or a high glycemic load food with a high insulin response. And for this reason, research from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition has provided an insulin index of common foods. So rather than eating and measuring how high your glucose gets in your blood, we would measure how high insulin gets in response to specific foods. So the glycemic index, glycemic load, and insulin index are all useful tools, but other methods for choosing carbohydrates should also be considered. Ideally, what we need is a way to monitor carbohydrates that we eat so that they serve us to the greatest benefit while also minimizing any negative impact to our body composition and health. So, how do we eat carbohydrates and not have it become a problem? Well, there are a few strategies for approaching this goal. It is clear that a lower glycemic index, lower glycemic load, and lower insulin index foods have the best potential to improve body composition, keep you healthy, and avoid large spikes in blood glucose and insulin. On the other hand, many prepackaged foods and other refined carbohydrates like cereal, many breads, candy, and soda will quickly get into your bloodstream and over time have the greatest chance for causing some negative health consequences. Things like insulin resistance, where your body has to produce more and more insulin just to have the same effect it normally should have. So, unprocessed carbohydrates like vegetables, which are high in fiber and nutrient density, meaning it has many beneficial nutrients compared to the calories that it contains, should be a staple of our carbohydrate intake compared to overly processed carbohydrates and added sugars. Eating this way regularly should improve your fiber intake, your micronutrient intake for things like vitamins and minerals, increase your feelings of fullness or satiety for a longer period of time after eating. Another step in keeping blood glucose levels balanced is to exercise. How exactly does this work? Well, getting glucose from your blood and into your muscles and into your fat cells for energy requires the help of the hormone insulin secreted from your pancreas. Cells use a small transporter protein to help glucose enter cells. And this glucose transporter is called GLUT4. And when it becomes active, like when insulin is present, like after a high sugar snack, GLUT4 is part of a large family of GLUT transport proteins that exist in different body tissues. But muscle contractions that occur with exercise also help to shuttle blood glucose into your cells without insulin. So, during and after exercise, you have a greater ability to use blood glucose to produce energy and after exercise to store glucose as muscle glycogen. You see, after exercise, you have used up at least some of your stored muscle glycogen. This depletion of stored glycogen and the exercise activity itself ramp up the activity of an enzyme called glycogen synthase, which is used to make glycogen in your cells. So, at the end of exercise, your body is primed and prepared to store glucose as glycogen. What's more is that the exercise increased your body's ability to be insulin sensitive, meaning you're more responsive to less of this powerful hormone. And theoretically then, the best time to consume any carbohydrate-heavy meals would be after vigorous exercise, because you've metabolically prepared to handle them the best that you can. I find it interesting that researchers have investigated what happens to a high-carb pasta meal both after rest and after exercise. As you might expect, after rest, the high-carb meal stopped the ability of these participants to burn fat. The authors wrote that this was because of the large insulin increase, which stops fat burning. But after moderate intensity exercise, just 60% of maximal effort, eating the high-carb pasta meal did not lower their ability to burn fat, and no body fat was gained. So the best time to eat a meal with a lot of carbohydrates to preserve your healthiest body composition is most likely right after you exercise. As you can tell, there is quite a bit to know when it comes to how carbohydrates can impact your body composition and health. They are required for many physiological mechanisms, including providing our brains and nervous system with energy. And although carbohydrates in excess will likely disrupt health and body composition, carbohydrates don't have to be off limits. We can choose to minimize added sugars in our diets. We can choose to eat low glycemic index and glycemic load carbohydrates, like vegetables, and less processed grains that are ultimately full of nutrients and fiber. This will help to give us a better overall diet quality and may help to keep us feeling full for a longer period of time compared to a diet with only high glycemic, sugary foods. It also looks like our bodies may best use carbohydrates after moderate to vigorous exercise sessions. It's after exercise when eating carbs would be most likely to restock your glycogen stores so you're ready to exercise again the next day and are least likely to store them as fat. Carbohydrates can and should be tailor-made to fit your activity level and body composition because carbohydrates play an important role in our overall nutritional intake. We don't have to fear them, but we should choose them wisely, eat appropriate portion sizes, and be smart about when to eat them. Try this. Aim to eat your most starchy meals of the day, like pasta, after your hardest workouts.